The most dangerous kind of paperwork is the kind arrogant people sign before they realize it can read louder than they can speak. Diane Prescott stood at the front counter of Turner Auto Service at 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon, dressed like she had come from a board meeting and expecting the room to bend around her title. Behind Caleb Turner, through the glass window into the service area, her dark blue sport utility vehicle sat finished, cleaned of fingerprints, keys tagged, work order closed, and ready for release. On the counter between them were three things Diane did not want to look at for very long: the final invoice, the signed estimate approval, and the intake form where she had written her own billing instructions in neat blue ink. Caleb kept one hand on the folder and the other near the register, calm enough that Diane seemed to take it as disrespect. She said he needed to bring the vehicle around immediately because she had already waited long enough, and because the repairs were connected to her work as president of Cedar Ridge Estates. The charge should be treated as community goodwill. Caleb did not move toward the keys. He did not argue about her title. He simply turned the signed work order toward her and said the vehicle was ready for release as soon as the invoice was paid or an approved billing account was provided. Diane's mouth tightened into the kind of smile people use when they are deciding whether to act offended or superior. "You cannot charge the Homeowners Association president after I brought you community business," she said. Caleb looked down at the paper, then back at her. "I am not charging the Homeowners Association president. I am charging the customer who signed the work order." The sentence took the air out of the office for half a second. Diane glanced toward the waiting area, where two customers pretended not to listen while clearly hearing every word. Then she leaned closer and lowered her voice, telling Caleb he was making a mistake if he thought Cedar Ridge residents would continue using a shop that treated community leadership this way. Caleb opened the folder without changing expression. The top page was the standard intake form she had signed. The second was the diagnostic authorization. The third was the repair estimate she had approved after the inspection. Under the billing note, in Diane's own handwriting, was the line that would eventually follow her into the clubhouse meeting: "Bill Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association as community relations expense." Caleb had not written those words. He had not suggested them. He had only done what his shop policy required when a customer wanted someone else to pay the bill. He had asked her to put the request in writing. Diane saw him looking at that line and quickly said the board would understand. Caleb slid another printed email across the counter. It was his confirmation from the day she approved the repair, clearly stating that Turner Auto Service had no purchase order from the association, no approved billing account, and that Diane remained the responsible customer unless authorized billing was received. Her reply was printed underneath it in plain text: "Proceed. The board will understand." Diane stared at the email like it had betrayed her. Caleb knew better. Paperwork did not betray anyone. It only remembered what people said when they thought nobody would make them stand behind it. 2 weeks earlier, Turner Auto Service had been running exactly the way Caleb Turner liked it: clean, predictable, and quiet enough for customers to trust what happened behind the counter. The shop sat just outside Cedar Ridge Estates on a small commercial road with a gas station at one end and a hardware store at the other, close enough that residents often walked over for oil changes, tire checks, and brake inspections, but separate enough that no homeowners association rule controlled the building. Caleb had leased the place after working for larger repair chains for nearly 10 years, and he built his reputation on one simple promise: nothing happened to a customer's vehicle unless the customer understood the work, approved the estimate, and knew who was paying for it. That was why the office wall had 3 policy signs in plain view. The first said diagnostic work required written authorization. The second said repairs required written estimate approval. The third said outside billing required a purchase order, approved account, or written confirmation from the paying organization before release. Customers sometimes joked that Caleb loved forms more than engines, but the people who had been burned by vague repair bills appreciated him. He kept intake forms clipped to each key tag, scanned every signed estimate, photographed parts before installation, and saved every approval email in the customer file. His part-time service writer, Megan Ellis, once told him his paperwork made the shop feel more like a bank than a garage. Caleb had smiled and said banks rarely had customers yelling about who approved a water pump. The system worked because it treated everyone the same. Retired teachers, landscapers, delivery drivers, and Cedar Ridge residents all signed the same forms. No title, address, or promise of future referrals changed the process. That mattered even more because Cedar Ridge Estates had a reputation for turning small favors into expectations. Caleb had seen it happen to the landscaper who trimmed extra hedges near the clubhouse once and then got blamed when residents expected it every month. He had seen it happen to a gate technician who answered one weekend call for free and then got added to a complaint thread when he charged normal rates the next time. Caleb did not judge the whole neighborhood by those stories, but he remembered them. Then Diane Prescott walked into the shop on a Tuesday morning with a leather folder under one arm and the confidence of someone who expected recognition before service. She introduced herself as president of the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, then mentioned that many residents had been discussing where to take their vehicles now that the dealership across town had raised prices. Caleb welcomed her like any customer and asked what brought her in. Diane said her dark blue sport utility vehicle had been making a grinding sound near the front wheels and that the brake pedal felt uneven at low speed. Caleb explained the diagnostic fee, the inspection process, and the estimate approval requirement. Diane listened with a polite smile, then said she hoped he would consider waiving the diagnostic charge as a gesture of partnership, since a good experience for her could lead to many Cedar Ridge referrals. Caleb did not embarrass her, but he did not bend the policy either. He told her referrals were appreciated, but the diagnostic fee applied to every customer because inspection time was labor time. Diane's smile stayed in place, but her eyes changed. She signed the intake form slowly, as if giving him one more chance to recognize who she was. Caleb tagged the keys, noted the mileage, and opened a customer file under her name. At that moment, it was still just another repair visit. The mistake came later, when Diane decided the forms she signed were less important than the title she carried. Caleb Turner had seen customers try to negotiate repair costs before, but Diane Prescott had a different style. She did not complain about the diagnostic fee directly after signing the intake form. Instead, she walked around the office as if studying the shop for future approval, glancing at the framed business license, the waiting chairs, the coffee station, and the policy signs on the wall. Megan Ellis took down the vehicle information while Caleb moved the dark blue sport utility vehicle into the first bay for inspection. Within 30 minutes, the problem was clear. The front brake pads were worn low, one rotor had uneven scoring, and a caliper slide was sticking badly enough to explain the grinding sound and the uneven pedal feel. It was not mysterious, and it was not cosmetic. The vehicle needed brake work before it could be driven comfortably every day. Caleb photographed the worn parts, saved the inspection notes, and prepared an estimate that included the diagnostic charge, parts, labor, and shop supplies. When he called Diane, she answered on the second ring with the background noise of a meeting room behind her. Caleb explained the findings in plain language and told her he would email the estimate for written approval before doing any repair. Diane listened, then asked if he could separate the numbers differently because the vehicle was used for homeowners association duties. Caleb paused long enough to choose his words carefully. He asked what she meant by association duties. Diane said she used the vehicle to attend board meetings, inspect landscaping, meet contractors, and handle community matters around Cedar Ridge Estates. She said that made the repair connected to her leadership responsibilities, and because Caleb's shop benefited from the neighborhood, it seemed reasonable to treat the work as a community relations expense. Caleb looked through the office window at the vehicle in his bay, then at the policy sign about outside billing. He had heard enough polished language to recognize a simple request wearing a suit. Diane was asking him to repair her personal vehicle without treating her like the person responsible for the bill. He told her that if an organization was paying, Turner Auto Service required a purchase order, an approved billing account, or written authorization from that organization before release. Diane answered that the board trusted her judgment and that requiring extra documents would only slow down a simple repair. Caleb said he could not bill an association based on verbal assurance. She gave a light laugh and said he was very formal for someone trying to build a relationship with Cedar Ridge residents. Caleb did not react to the pressure. He told her he would send the estimate and a billing instruction form, and she could write exactly how she wanted the invoice handled. He also said, clearly, that unless approved outside billing was received, the person who signed the intake form remained responsible for payment. Diane said that would be fine and told him to send it over. 10 minutes later, Caleb emailed the estimate, the diagnostic authorization copy, the shop billing policy, and a blank line for billing notes. He expected Diane to either approve the repair as a regular customer or contact the association for proper authorization. Instead, she replied with the signed estimate attached and a handwritten billing note added beneath her signature. Bill Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association as community relations expense. Under that, in the email body, she wrote one sentence that sounded confident enough to become evidence later. Proceed. The board will understand. Megan read the email over Caleb's shoulder and raised her eyebrows. Caleb did not smile. He forwarded a confirmation immediately, stating that the shop had no purchase order, no approved association account, and no written board authorization, so Diane would remain the responsible customer unless Cedar Ridge Estates provided approved billing before release. Diane did not object. She only replied, "Thank you. Please complete the work." That was the moment the repair stopped being unusual and started becoming documented. Caleb Turner treated Diane Prescott's approval the same way he treated every other signed estimate, because that was the only way the paperwork would stay clean. He did not rush the repair to impress her, and he did not slow it down to make a point. He printed the signed estimate, attached it to the work order, saved Diane's email confirmation in the customer file, and placed a note at the top from Megan Ellis. No outside billing approved. Customer remains responsible unless purchase order received before release. Then he walked back into the service bay and started the work exactly as authorized. The dark blue sport utility vehicle was lifted carefully. The wheels came off, and Caleb photographed the worn brake pads, the scored rotor, and the sticking caliper slide before removing anything. He had learned years earlier that good photos could prevent bad arguments. Some customers forgot what they approved. Some remembered only the final number. Some people, like Diane, seemed ready to remember whatever version helped them most. Caleb replaced only the parts listed on the estimate. He did not add upgrades, did not include unnecessary labor, and did not touch anything outside the approved brake repair. Every part box was placed on the bench, every receipt was scanned, and every labor note was entered into the system with the time and task listed clearly. Megan prepared the invoice while Caleb completed the final inspection. The brake pedal felt steady, the grinding sound was gone, and the road test around the commercial block showed the vehicle stopping smoothly at low speed. By 3:12 in the afternoon, the repair was complete, the keys were tagged, and the sport utility vehicle was parked in the finished area behind the glass service window. Caleb emailed Diane the final invoice, the paid diagnostic credit applied against the approved work, the parts receipts, the labor summary, and the release policy. He wrote that the vehicle was ready for pickup once payment was completed or approved association billing was provided. He also repeated, in plain language, that Turner Auto Service had still not received a purchase order, account approval, or written authorization from Cedar Ridge Estates. The first reply came from Diane 26 minutes later. It was not payment, and it was not a purchase order. She wrote that she was disappointed Caleb had continued to treat the repair as a personal transaction after she had explained its community purpose. She said the board would not appreciate being pressured by unnecessary billing language, and that Caleb should release the vehicle as a show of trust while the association handled the paperwork internally. Caleb read the email twice, then looked through the window at the finished vehicle. The repair was done. The paperwork was complete. The only missing piece was the same piece Diane had avoided from the beginning, actual authorization from the organization she wanted to bill. He replied that Turner Auto Service could not release a vehicle on an unapproved promise of future payment, and that the customer who signed the work order remained responsible until valid outside billing was approved. Diane did not answer for almost an hour. When she finally did, her tone had changed from polished to sharp. She wrote that refusing release would be viewed as hostile to Cedar Ridge leadership and damaging to the relationship between the shop and the community. Caleb saved the email, printed it, and added it to the file. Megan asked if he wanted her to call the association office directly. Caleb shook his head. If Diane wanted the board involved, she would involve them herself. His job was not to chase her story. His job was to keep the record in order before she tried to rewrite it. By 4:17 that afternoon, Diane Prescott had stopped writing emails and decided to appear in person, which told Caleb Turner exactly how confident she still felt about controlling the situation. She walked into Turner Auto Service with her leather folder tucked under one arm, her phone in her hand, and the polished expression of someone who expected a small business owner to become nervous once the conversation moved from email to eye contact. Megan Ellis looked up from the front desk, greeted her politely, and said the vehicle was ready for release once payment was completed. Diane did not answer Megan. She looked straight at Caleb through the office doorway and said she wanted her keys. Caleb came to the counter with the invoice, the signed work order, the estimate approval, and the billing policy already arranged in front of him. The repair total matched the approved estimate. The diagnostic charge had been applied properly. The parts receipts were attached. Nothing had been added outside the signed authorization. Diane glanced at the invoice and immediately pushed it back with 2 fingers. She said Caleb was misunderstanding the nature of the repair because the vehicle was used for association responsibilities and therefore should not be treated like an ordinary personal expense. Caleb answered that he could release the vehicle to her immediately with payment, or he could release it under Cedar Ridge Estates billing if the association provided an approved purchase order or written account authorization. Diane said she had already given him the billing instruction. Caleb turned the intake form toward her and pointed to the handwritten note she had added. Bill Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association as community relations expense. Then he placed his confirmation email beside it, the one that clearly stated the shop had no purchase order and that Diane remained responsible unless approved billing arrived before release. Diane did not deny writing the note. She did not deny receiving the email. Instead, she said the board would understand once she explained that Caleb was creating unnecessary friction with community leadership. Caleb kept his voice level and said the board was welcome to contact the shop, but the vehicle could not leave on an unapproved promise of payment. A customer waiting near the coffee station shifted in his chair, and Diane noticed. Her voice dropped, but the pressure sharpened. She told Caleb that Cedar Ridge residents paid attention to which businesses respected the neighborhood and which ones made things difficult. Caleb knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted him to imagine lost referrals, bad comments, resident warnings, and a reputation problem big enough to make a signed invoice feel smaller than her title. But Caleb had built his shop by refusing to make money decisions based on fear. He slid a clean copy of the release policy across the counter and said the keys would remain secured until the invoice was paid or valid outside billing was approved. Diane stared at him for a long moment, then picked up her phone and began typing while still standing at the counter. She copied the Cedar Ridge Estates board, the community manager, and 2 committee chairs into a message claiming that Turner Auto Service was refusing to release a vehicle tied to association duties, attempting to force payment from a community leader, and damaging the partnership between residents and local vendors. Caleb waited until the email arrived in his inbox, then printed it, clipped it behind the previous messages, and replied to the entire group with the signed estimate, the handwritten billing note, his confirmation about missing purchase order, the final invoice, and the release policy. He added one sentence. Turner Auto Service is ready to release the vehicle upon payment by the responsible customer or approved billing authorization from Cedar Ridge Estates. Diane read the reply on her phone before she even reached the door. For the first time, her face showed the smallest sign of concern. She had pulled the board into the room, but Caleb had brought the paperwork with her. For almost 10 minutes after Diane Prescott left the office, Turner Auto Service felt unusually still. Caleb Turner stood behind the counter with the email thread open on his screen, watching the reply list grow as board members began reading what Diane had copied them into. Megan Ellis looked from the computer to the finished sport utility vehicle behind the glass and said quietly that Diane had probably expected him to panic once the homeowners association was included. Caleb nodded, but he was not worried about the board seeing the paperwork. He was more interested in which parts Diane would try to explain away now that everyone had the same documents in front of them. The first response came from the community manager, Allison Grant, who asked whether Cedar Ridge Estates had issued a purchase order for the repair. Caleb answered that Turner Auto Service had received no purchase order, no approved billing account, and no written board authorization. He attached the billing policy again, along with the page Diane had signed. Then a board member named Robert Hayes asked whether Diane's vehicle was owned by the association. Caleb did not answer for Diane. He simply replied that the intake form listed Diane Prescott as the customer. The vehicle registration shown at drop-off matched her personal information, and no association ownership documents had been provided. That question changed the tone of the thread. For the first time, someone inside Cedar Ridge was not asking why Caleb was holding firm. They were asking why Diane had made a personal repair sound like association business. Diane responded within minutes, writing that board members should not reduce community leadership to narrow technicalities, and that her vehicle was regularly used for neighborhood responsibilities. Caleb read the message twice and saved it. The word technicalities did not bother him. People usually called rules technicalities when the rules stopped helping them. Allison then asked Diane directly whether the board had voted to cover the repair or authorize the expense. Diane did not answer yes. Instead, she wrote that she had acted in the spirit of community partnership and expected the board to support practical decisions made by its president. Megan let out a soft breath when she saw that. Caleb printed the email and added it to the folder. By 5:30, Diane had shifted from demanding release to demanding an emergency board discussion. She claimed the situation was damaging Cedar Ridge's relationship with local vendors and that Caleb was creating a public embarrassment by refusing to cooperate. Caleb replied one final time before closing the shop for the evening. He wrote that the vehicle was secure, completed, and ready for release upon payment by the responsible customer or valid authorization from Cedar Ridge Estates. He also stated that Turner Auto Service would provide the full customer file to the board if Diane requested that the matter be discussed publicly. Less than 20 minutes later, Allison forwarded Caleb a meeting notice for that night at the Cedar Ridge clubhouse and asked if he would attend to clarify the business records. Caleb looked through the service window at Diane's finished vehicle, then at the folder now thick with forms, emails, photographs, parts receipts, and signed approvals. He had no interest in arguing inside a clubhouse full of residents, but Diane had built the room herself by copying the board into a bill she did not want to pay. At 7 o'clock, Caleb locked the vehicle keys in the office safe, turned off the bay lights, and drove to Cedar Ridge Estates with the folder on the passenger seat. Diane wanted the board to see a business owner refusing to respect her authority. Caleb was bringing every page that showed exactly what her authority had tried to buy. The Cedar Ridge clubhouse was almost full when Caleb Turner walked in, but the room did not feel like a normal neighborhood meeting. It felt like Diane Prescott had prepared an audience. Board members sat along the long front table, residents filled the folding chairs, and Diane stood near the center with her leather folder open as if she were about to present a serious vendor issue instead of a repair invoice she had personally approved. Caleb took a seat near the side wall and placed his folder on his lap. He did not look around for support. He did not need anyone to like him for the paperwork to be true. Allison Grant, the community manager, opened the meeting by saying the board had received conflicting information about a vehicle repair connected to Cedar Ridge Estates and wanted to determine whether the association had any responsibility for the invoice. Diane spoke first. She thanked everyone for taking the matter seriously, then explained that her vehicle was used regularly for association duties, including meeting contractors, checking landscaping concerns, and attending board functions. She said Caleb's shop had been given an opportunity to build a strong relationship with the neighborhood, but instead he had taken a rigid approach, completed the repair, and refused to release the vehicle unless she paid personally. Several residents murmured when she said that, and Caleb could tell which version they had heard before he arrived. Diane continued, saying she had clearly told the shop the repair was community-related, and that Caleb had used paperwork to create confusion after the fact. That was the first sentence that made Caleb open his folder. Robert Hayes asked Caleb if he wanted to respond. Caleb stood and walked to the front table, not with a speech, but with copies. He handed Allison the intake form first. It listed Diane Prescott as the customer. Then he handed over the diagnostic authorization with her signature, the estimate approval with her signature, and the final invoice matching the approved amount. He explained that the repair was performed only after Diane authorized it in writing, and that no extra work had been added. Diane interrupted to say he was leaving out the community context. Caleb nodded once and handed Allison the billing note Diane had written herself. Bill Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association as community relations expense. Then he handed over his confirmation email, the one sent before the work was completed, stating that Turner Auto Service had no purchase order, no approved association billing account, and no written board authorization, so Diane remained the responsible customer unless valid outside billing was approved before release. Under that message was Diane's reply. Proceed. The board will understand. The room changed after that. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that Diane noticed. Allison looked at the page for a long moment, then asked Diane whether the board had approved the expense before the work was done. Diane said she had acted based on her understanding of what benefited the community. Robert asked again, more directly, whether there had been a vote, a purchase order, or written authorization from Cedar Ridge Estates. Diane did not answer yes. Caleb placed the shop billing policy beside the emails and said the vehicle was ready for release at any time with payment from the responsible customer or approved billing from the association. He did not accuse Diane of anything. He did not need to. Her own paperwork had already shown the board what she tried to turn into their problem. Allison Grant placed Diane Prescott's handwritten billing note beside Caleb Turner's confirmation email, and for several seconds the only sound in the clubhouse was the quiet hum of the ceiling vents. Diane had expected the board to focus on Caleb refusing to release the vehicle, but the papers made the question much narrower and much more uncomfortable. Robert Hayes asked the community manager to explain what would normally happen if a board member wanted the association to pay a vendor for any service. Allison answered carefully. There would need to be a board-approved expense, a purchase order, a written contract, or documented authorization from the management office before the vendor could bill Cedar Ridge Estates. None of those existed for Diane's repair. Diane immediately said the situation was different because the vehicle helped her perform association duties. Caleb stayed silent. He had learned that the more Diane explained, the more distance opened between her words and her paperwork. Another board member, Karen Whitlock, asked whether Cedar Ridge owned or insured the vehicle. Diane said no, but repeated that she often used it for community business. Karen looked at the invoice and said many residents used personal vehicles to attend meetings, check mail, visit neighbors, or report landscaping issues, but that did not turn brake repairs into association expenses. A few residents nodded. Diane's posture stiffened. She said the board was missing the larger issue, which was Caleb's unwillingness to support a neighborhood that could send him steady customers. That was when Allison turned to Caleb and asked whether he had promised any discount, free repair, or special billing arrangement in exchange for referrals. Caleb opened the file and handed over the original estimate email. He said no special arrangement had been offered or accepted. The estimate showed normal pricing, normal labor, and normal parts. The only unusual part of the file was Diane's request to bill the association without approved billing. Diane tried to call that interpretation unfair, but Robert asked her to read her own reply aloud. She looked down at the printed page, then stopped. Allison read it instead. Proceed. The board will understand. The room absorbed those words differently the second time. They no longer sounded like confidence. They sounded like someone assuming approval after spending money. Caleb then showed the parts receipts, the brake photos, the signed estimate, and the road test note. He explained that the repair was completed exactly as authorized, that the vehicle was secure at the shop, and that it could be released immediately once payment was made by Diane or once valid association billing was approved. He emphasized that Turner Auto Service was not asking the board to punish anyone, only to clarify who was responsible for the invoice. That calmness made Diane look more aggressive by comparison. She said Caleb had used her trust against her. Caleb turned slightly toward her and said he had not added a single word to the billing note, had not changed the estimate, and had sent written clarification before completing the work. Allison asked Diane one final question. Did she have written approval from Cedar Ridge Estates before instructing the shop to bill the association? Diane looked toward the residents, then back to the board, and finally said she believed approval would be understood. Robert leaned back and said belief was not authorization. That sentence ended the argument before anyone officially voted. The board agreed that Cedar Ridge Estates would not pay the invoice, would not label the repair an association expense, and would not pressure Turner Auto Service to release the vehicle without payment. Diane's face stayed composed, but the authority around her had shifted. She had walked in claiming Caleb trapped her with paperwork. She was leaving with the board staring at the paperwork she had created herself. After the board made its decision, the clubhouse did not empty with the easy chatter of a normal meeting. Residents left in small groups, speaking quietly, while Diane Prescott remained near the front table with her leather folder still open and her expression carefully controlled. Caleb Turner gathered his papers one page at a time, placing the signed estimate, billing note, confirmation email, parts receipts, and release policy back into the folder in the same order he had presented them. He did not look victorious. He looked like a man who had come to clarify an invoice and was ready to return to work. That seemed to irritate Diane more than any speech could have. She approached him near the side door and said he had embarrassed her in front of her own community. Caleb kept his voice low and steady. I answered the questions the board asked. Diane said he knew exactly what he was doing when he asked her to put the billing note in writing. Caleb shook his head. I asked for written billing instructions because you wanted someone else to pay your invoice. That is standard policy. Diane looked toward Allison Grant and Robert Hayes, who were still talking at the front table, then back at Caleb. She said the invoice would be paid, but he should not expect Cedar Ridge residents to forget how he handled this. Caleb had heard that kind of warning before. It was not really about memory. It was about fear. He told her the vehicle would be released as soon as payment was completed by the responsible customer, and that the keys were secured at the shop. Diane did not answer. She walked out of the clubhouse first, leaving the board members to clean up the silence behind her. 20 minutes later, Caleb was back at Turner Auto Service with Megan Ellis waiting near the front desk. The dark blue sport utility vehicle sat behind the glass, finished and ready exactly as it had been before the meeting. At 8:46 that evening, Diane walked in without the leather folder. She carried only her wallet, her phone, and the kind of stiff pride that made every step look expensive. She placed a credit card on the counter and said she was paying under protest. Caleb entered the payment, printed the receipt, and wrote paid by customer on the invoice record. Then he handed her a release receipt stating that the vehicle had been repaired according to the signed estimate, released after payment, and returned with no additional work performed beyond authorization. Diane read the form, clearly searching for language she could object to, but there was nothing dramatic on the page. Just dates, amounts, signatures, and facts. She signed with sharp pressure, took the keys, and walked toward the service area. Caleb opened the bay door and stood back as she inspected the vehicle. The brake repair was complete. The engine started normally. The dashboard showed no warning lights connected to the repair. The sport utility vehicle rolled out of the finished area without trouble, and for a moment Diane seemed almost disappointed that there was nothing else to accuse him of. Before leaving, she lowered the window and told Caleb he could have handled it with more respect. Caleb looked at the signed receipt in his hand and answered, "Respect is why I keep the same rules for everyone." Diane drove away without another word. The next morning, Allison Grant emailed Caleb a brief note confirming that Cedar Ridge Estates considered the invoice a personal matter and that no association complaint would be filed against Turner Auto Service. Attached to the message was a new internal policy draft requiring written board approval before any officer could contact a vendor on behalf of the association, promise referrals, request special terms, or suggest association billing for a personal expense. Caleb read it once, forwarded it to Megan for the file, and went back to the workboard. The repair was over, but Diane's paperwork had not finished speaking. By the end of that week, the repair itself had become the smallest part of what happened at Turner Auto Service. Caleb Turner filed Diane Prescott's paid invoice, signed release receipt, estimate approval, billing note, email thread, parts receipts, and board confirmation into one clean customer record, then returned to the rhythm his shop depended on. Oil changes came in. Brake inspections went out. A delivery driver dropped off filters before lunch. Megan Ellis answered phones, scheduled appointments, and quietly watched as several Cedar Ridge residents came through the door with a different attitude than before. Some apologized for what they had heard. Some simply paid their invoices without comment. One older resident told Caleb that it was good someone finally made the board follow the same rules everyone else had to follow. Caleb did not turn the moment into gossip. He only said the shop appreciated clear paperwork and fair business. Across the road, the Cedar Ridge board moved faster than anyone expected. Allison Grant's internal policy draft became an official procedure within 10 days. No officer could promise vendor referrals in exchange for discounts. No board member could request special pricing under the name of the association without written approval. No personal expense could be described as community relations without a vote, a purchase order, and documentation from the management office. Resident-wide complaints about outside businesses now required board review before being sent. The language sounded dry, but everyone understood why it existed. Diane tried to present the new rules as a general improvement, but the room had changed around her. At the next monthly meeting, Robert Hayes asked that Diane's handling of the repair invoice be added to the governance review. Karen Whitlock supported the motion. Allison provided the email record, including Diane's handwritten request to bill the association and the message saying, "Proceed. The board will understand." Diane stayed polished through most of it, but polished confidence did not work the same way once people had seen the forms. She argued that she had acted in good faith and believed the repair was connected to her responsibilities. Robert answered that good faith still required authorization when spending other people's money. That sentence traveled through Cedar Ridge faster than Diane wanted. 2 weeks later, she resigned as president, saying the board needed a fresh voice and fewer distractions. Caleb heard about it from Megan, who saw the notice posted on the neighborhood website. He did not celebrate. He did not frame the email. He did not tell customers that he had beaten anyone. The truth was simpler and colder than that. Diane had not lost her position because Caleb argued better. She lost it because every form she signed said what she later tried to deny. A few days after her resignation, Caleb added a small sign under the billing policy in the office. It read, "If you want special terms, put them in writing." Customers laughed when they saw it, but Caleb meant every word. Special treatment always sounded harmless until someone expected everybody else to pay for it. Months later, Cedar Ridge residents still brought vehicles to Turner Auto Service, and Caleb still used the same forms for all of them. Diagnostic authorization first. Estimate approval before repairs. Purchase order before outside billing. Paid invoice before release. It was not personal. That was the point. Diane had walked into his shop thinking paperwork was just something small businesses used because they lacked power. In the end, the repair did not end her authority. Her own signature did.